The grand chandelier cast a golden glow over the opulent ballroom, its light shimmering off the polished marble floors. Laughter echoed through the vast space, mingling with the clinking of crystal glasses and the hum of conversation. The air carried the scent of expensive cologne and fresh roses, an unmistakable mark of high society. Every guest was draped in elegance, women in silk gowns, men in tailored suits, each person perfectly in place, except for one. At the farthest corner of the room, where the light barely reached, sat a woman whose presence seemed almost accidental. Her dress, though neat, lacked the extravagance of the others. Her hair was pinned in a simple knot, and she held herself with quiet composure, despite the whispers that floated her way. She was an outsider in this world of wealth and arrogance, a woman of modest means who had somehow found herself here. Her name was Eleanor. She had come as a companion to her employer, the widow of a well-respected businessman, and was meant to simply blend into the background. But that was before the laughter started, the cruel, mocking laughter that had drawn every eye in the room toward her. "Tell me, dear Miss Eleanor," a sharp voice sliced through the air, dripping with amusement. It belonged to Lady Agatha, a woman who thrived on belittling those beneath her. "I hear you're quite musically inclined. Is it true?" Eleanor's fingers instinctively tightened around the hem of her dress. She knew what was coming. "Yes, yes," another guest chimed in, an aristocratic man whose face was permanently set in an expression of bored amusement. "They say she plays the piano quite well. What a delightful surprise. Why don't we all have a little entertainment?" The murmurs of agreement spread like wildfire. Some were genuinely curious, but most simply wanted to witness a spectacle, to watch this simple woman fumble, to revel in her embarrassment. Eleanor swallowed hard. It wasn't that she feared playing. Music was the one place where she felt truly herself. But she understood their game. They expected her to falter, to prove them right, that a woman of her station had no place among them. "Go on," Lady Agatha pressed, her lips curling into a smirk. "Surely you wouldn't deny us a performance?" Eleanor lifted her chin. "If that is what you wish," she said softly. The crowd parted as she stepped forward, each footfall measured, deliberate. The grand piano stood at the center of the room, its ivory keys gleaming under the chandelier's glow. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting, expecting failure. She sat down, placing her hands lightly on the keys. For a moment, she was still. The room held its breath. Then she played. A single note rang through the air, pure and unwavering. Then another, and another. The melody unfolded like a whispered secret, delicate yet powerful. Eleanor's fingers moved with effortless grace, pouring her soul into every chord. What began as curiosity in the audience's faces quickly shifted into something else. Shock. Astonishment. A rare, humbling silence. As the final note faded into the air, Eleanor lifted her gaze, meeting their stunned expressions with quiet defiance. And then, the silence in the ballroom stretched on longer than anyone had expected. A space once filled with laughter and mockery now felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Eleanor kept her hands resting on the keys, her breathing steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs. She knew what they had anticipated, a clumsy attempt, an awkward mistake. But what they got was something else entirely. Someone in the crowd shifted, the rustle of fabric breaking the stillness. Lady Agatha, who had been so confident in her cruelty just moments ago, stared at Eleanor with something caught between disbelief and irritation. A few guests exchanged glances, uncertain how to react. Applause should have come naturally after such a performance, but instead, there was hesitation. To acknowledge her talent meant admitting they had been wrong. And people like them did not like to be wrong. Eleanor finally rose from the bench, smoothing her dress as she did. She made no move to gloat or seek approval. She simply turned away from the piano, prepared to return to her quiet place in the background. But before she could take a step, a voice spoke. "That was remarkable. The words belonged to a man standing near the center of the room, his dark eyes fixed on her with something unreadable. He was not like the others. While the rest of the guests draped themselves in wealth-like armor, he carried himself differently. There was an ease in the way he held his glass, a quiet confidence in his stance. His name was Charles Whitmore, a name that carried weight in circles of influence. A man of business, of power. And now, a man intrigued. Eleanor met his gaze but said nothing. She had learned long ago that words often did little to change the minds of people like these. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, stepping forward. The room, still trapped in its stunned silence, watched closely. Eleanor hesitated. "I taught myself." A murmur rippled through the guests. The idea seemed impossible. Music of that caliber could not simply be self-taught. It required tutors, practice halls, hours of careful instruction. "Unbelievable," another guest whispered under their breath. But Charles was not so quick to dismiss her. "You have a rare gift," he said, tilting his head slightly. "One that does not belong in the shadows." Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. She did not know what game he was playing, but she had no intention of being a piece on someone else's board. "I'm afraid I am quite content in the shadows," she replied evenly. A small smile touched his lips, but before he could say more, Lady Agatha recovered from her shock. With a forced laugh, she waved a delicate hand through the air. "Well, that was certainly unexpected," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "What a delightful surprise indeed." It was an attempt to regain control, to shift the mood of the room back to what it had been. And slowly, the guests followed her lead. The tension loosened. Conversations resumed, drinks were refilled, and soon, it was as if nothing had happened. But Eleanor knew better. She could feel it in the glances thrown her way, the whispers spoken behind gloved hands. She had disrupted something tonight. She returned to her quiet corner, her hands still tingling from the music she had played. She should have felt satisfaction, perhaps even pride, but instead, there was only unease. As the night stretched on, she remained an observer. She watched Charles Whitmore as he moved through the crowd, his gaze flickering toward her now and then. She watched Lady Agatha, whose forced smile grew tighter each time someone mentioned Eleanor's performance. And most of all, she watched the doors, waiting for the moment she could finally leave. Because deep down, she knew something had changed tonight. And change always came with a price. The night finally came to an end, but Eleanor knew it was only the beginning of something she had not asked for. As she stepped outside into the crisp night air, she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The grand estate behind her still buzzed with life, music spilling out through the windows, laughter echoing in the distance. She could still feel their eyes on her, the weight of their curiosity, their unease. Her employer, Mrs. Winslow, walked beside her, silent for the first few moments. Then, in a low voice, she said, "You shouldn't have done that." Eleanor glanced at the older woman. "You mean I shouldn't have played?" Mrs. Winslow sighed, shaking her head. "No, my dear. You shouldn't have been better than them." Eleanor stiffened, understanding what she meant. The people at that party had expected to laugh at her, to feel superior. Instead, she had given them something they couldn't ignore, something that made them question their own place in the world. And people of power did not like being questioned. They reached the carriage, and as Eleanor stepped inside, she saw movement from the corner of her eye. A figure stood near the entrance of the estate, watching her. Charles Whitmore. Even in the dim light, she could see the intrigue on his face, the way he studied her as if trying to solve a puzzle. She quickly looked away. She had no interest in becoming anyone's puzzle. The following days passed in a strange haze. Eleanor returned to her quiet duties, helping Mrs. Winslow manage the house, accompanying her on errands, blending back into the background as she always had. But something had shifted. People whispered when she walked by. The baker, who had never paid her any mind before, now looked at her with something like admiration. A woman at the market, whom Eleanor had never spoken to, suddenly asked if she taught music lessons. Word had spread. She ignored it, kept her head down, and tried to move on as if nothing had changed. But one afternoon, as she was arranging fresh flowers in the sitting room, a knock came at the door. The maid answered, and a deep voice followed. "I'm here to see Miss Eleanor." Eleanor froze. Mrs. Winslow appeared in the doorway just as the visitor stepped inside. Charles Whitmore. He was dressed sharply, as always, but there was something almost casual about his presence, like he had all the time in the world to stand here and wait for her answer. Mrs. Winslow's expression barely flickered. "Mr. Whitmore," she said smoothly, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" His gaze never left Eleanor. "I've come with an offer." Eleanor placed the flowers down carefully. "I'm afraid I don't need any offers, sir." His lips twitched, almost amused. "You might want to hear this one." Mrs. Winslow's posture remained rigid. "Miss Eleanor is employed in this household and has no interest in—" "I would like her to perform," Charles interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "A private gathering. Nothing extravagant." Eleanor inhaled slowly. "I don't perform." "You did the other night," he pointed out. "And quite well, I might add." "That was different." "How so?" She didn't answer. Because she wasn't sure. Mrs. Winslow finally stepped forward. "I appreciate the interest in my companion, Mr. Whitmore, but as she said, she is not a performer." Charles studied Eleanor for a long moment before nodding. "Understood." But something in his tone told her he wasn't finished. He tipped his hat slightly and turned to leave. But just before he stepped out, he glanced back at her. "You have a gift, Miss Eleanor. I hope you don't let it go to waste." And with that, he was gone. The door shut behind him, but the tension in the room remained. Mrs. Winslow turned to Eleanor, eyes sharp. "He is not someone you want to be tangled with," she warned. "I have no intention of being tangled with anyone," Eleanor assured her. But even as she said the words, she knew they rang hollow. Because no matter how much she tried to push it away, the truth was undeniable. Something had begun the night of the party. And whether she liked it or not, it wasn't over yet. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy quiet. Eleanor carried on with her routine, but something inside her felt unsettled, like a thread had been pulled loose and she was waiting for everything to unravel. The world around her seemed to shift in ways she couldn't control. People whispered her name in places they never had before. Strangers glanced at her as if they suddenly saw something in her they hadn't noticed before. But what troubled her most was the way Charles Whitmore lingered in her thoughts. She told herself it was nothing, just the echo of an interaction that had been out of the ordinary. Yet every time she replayed the conversation, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had not seen the last of him. Her suspicions were confirmed when another invitation arrived. This time, it wasn't for a grand party filled with arrogant guests. It was simpler, more direct. A letter, written in a precise hand, delivered by a messenger who gave no explanation. "Miss Eleanor, there is a world that exists beyond the one you have been given. If you are willing to step into it, come to Whitmore Hall tomorrow evening. No tricks, no games, just music. C.W." She read it twice. Then a third time. Mrs. Winslow frowned as she watched her. "You should burn that letter." Eleanor placed it on the table. "And if I don't?" The older woman's eyes darkened. "Then you may find yourself in a place you cannot return from." That should have been enough to make her refuse. It should have been enough to silence the quiet voice in her heart that wondered, what if? But curiosity was a dangerous thing. The following evening, she found herself standing at the entrance of Whitmore Hall, staring up at the towering doors. The estate was grand, yet different from the ones she had visited before. It lacked the excessive displays of wealth meant to intimidate. Instead, it carried a quiet power, as if the very walls held secrets. A servant led her inside, down a long corridor lined with oil paintings of men and women who had come before. The flickering candlelight cast shadows over their faces, making them look almost alive. Then, the doors at the end of the hallway opened. Charles stood in the center of a lavish yet strangely intimate music room. The grand piano sat in the middle, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow of the chandelier. But there was no audience, no expectant crowd waiting to mock her. Just him. Eleanor hesitated. "What is this?" He gestured toward the piano. "A chance." She narrowed her eyes. "A chance for what?" "To play." She crossed her arms. "And why would I do that?" Charles smiled slightly. "Because you want to." The simple truth of it sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to deny it, to walk away and pretend none of this mattered. But her feet carried her forward, closer to the instrument that had felt like both a gift and a burden all her life. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys. There was no one here to judge her, no one waiting to tear her down. It was just the music. She played. Soft at first, then stronger, the notes weaving through the air like threads of something unseen. The walls of Whitmore Hall absorbed the sound, as if they had been waiting for it. When she finally stopped, the silence was different from before. It wasn't one of shock or disbelief. It was something else. Reverence. Charles exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. "I was right." Eleanor looked at him warily. "About what?" His eyes gleamed. "You don't belong in the shadows." A chill ran down her spine. There was something unsettling about the certainty in his voice, the way he looked at her as though he had just found something valuable. She stood abruptly. "I should go." He didn't stop her. But as she reached the door, his voice followed her. "You have a gift, Eleanor. You can either let it fade into nothing, or let it become something greater than you ever imagined." She left without another word, but his voice stayed with her, echoing in the deepest corners of her mind. And for the first time, she feared that maybe, just maybe, he was right. Eleanor left Whitmore Hall with hurried steps, the cold night air sharp against her skin. Every instinct told her she had made a mistake by coming. She should have never sat at that piano, should have never let Charles Whitmore plant those words in her mind. But no matter how much she wanted to push them away, they clung to her, wrapping around her thoughts like a melody that refused to fade. The walk back to Mrs. Winslow's home felt longer than usual. The streets were quiet, lined with the flickering glow of lanterns, but something about the silence unsettled her. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, an uneasy feeling creeping through her chest. When she finally reached the house, she paused at the door, her breath uneven. She had expected darkness inside, for Mrs. Winslow to be asleep by now. Instead, a dim light flickered from the sitting room. Eleanor stepped inside cautiously, closing the door behind her. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Then she saw her, Mrs. Winslow, standing near the fireplace, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You went," the older woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor stiffened. "You knew?" Mrs. Winslow exhaled, shaking her head. "I knew he wouldn't give up." Eleanor frowned. "What does that mean?" A long silence followed. Then, in a voice filled with something close to regret, Mrs. Winslow said, "Charles Whitmore is not just a man who enjoys music. He is a man who sees value where others do not. And when he sees something valuable, he does not let it go." A chill ran through Eleanor. She thought back to the way Charles had looked at her, not just with admiration, but with certainty, as if he had already decided something about her fate. Mrs. Winslow stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "You don't understand what you've stepped into, do you?" Eleanor swallowed. "It was just a song." The older woman shook her head. "No, my dear. It was an invitation. And now you must be very careful." Before Eleanor could respond, A sudden knock at the door made both women freeze. It was firm, deliberate, the kind that sent a ripple of unease through the air. Mrs. Winslow's fingers tightened around Eleanor's wrist, her eyes dark with warning. "Say nothing," she whispered. Eleanor's pulse pounded as the older woman moved to answer the door. The moment it opened, a deep voice spoke. "Apologies for the late hour," the man said, his tone calm yet authoritative. "I am here on behalf of Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor's breath caught. Mrs. Winslow remained composed. "It is quite late, sir. Whatever business Mr. Whitmore has can wait until morning." A pause. Then, "I'm afraid this matter is rather urgent." Eleanor felt her stomach twist. Mrs. Winslow hesitated, then finally stepped aside. A tall figure entered, his coat lined with the mark of Whitmore's estate. His face was unreadable, his presence carrying a quiet weight. He didn't look at Mrs. Winslow. His gaze went straight to Eleanor. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice steady, "Mr. Whitmore requests your presence." Immediately, the room felt colder. Mrs. Winslow moved slightly in front of Eleanor, her voice sharper now. "She is not at Mr. Whitmore's disposal." The man's expression did not change. "He insists." Eleanor's mind raced. There was no anger in the man's voice, no threat, but there was no request either. This was not an invitation. It was a summons. And in that moment she realized, Charles Whitmore had no intention of letting her slip away. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. The room, though familiar, suddenly felt suffocating. The Whitmore messenger stood firm, his expression unreadable, but she could feel the silent urgency behind his words. Mrs. Winslow turned to her, her eyes filled with quiet desperation. "You don't have to go," she whispered. But Eleanor knew better. If she refused now, Charles Whitmore wouldn't simply forget. He wasn't the kind of man who let things go. He had made it clear she was of value to him, and men like him didn't accept being denied. Slowly, she nodded. "I'll go." Mrs. Winslow's face twisted in frustration, but she didn't argue. Instead, she gave Eleanor a look, one that held years of unspoken warnings, of regret for things that couldn't be undone. The carriage ride to Whitmore Hall was silent. The roads were empty, the air thick with an uneasy stillness. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let fear take over. When the carriage finally stopped, the doors of Whitmore Hall were already open, as if they had been expecting her. The servant led her inside without a word, guiding her back to the music room where she had played just nights ago. But this time, she wasn't alone. Charles stood near the piano, his dark eyes already locked onto her as she entered. He was composed, as always, but there was something different about his gaze tonight, something sharper. "You came," he said simply. Eleanor lifted her chin. "Did I really have a choice?" A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "There is always a choice. But you made the right one." She stayed near the doorway, refusing to step further into his world than necessary. "Why am I here?" His expression remained unreadable. "Because you are wasting something extraordinary." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Music is not my future." Charles studied her for a moment before stepping closer. "You're wrong," he said softly. "It is your future, whether you want it or not." She felt a chill run through her. "I don't belong in your world." His gaze darkened. "You belong wherever your talent takes you." Eleanor swallowed hard. "And if I refuse?" Charles exhaled, as if disappointed. "Then you walk away from something that could change everything." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Eleanor's heart pounded, the weight of the decision pressing against her. She had spent her life fading into the background, avoiding attention, avoiding risk. But now, she stood at a crossroads. Then, before she could speak, the doors behind her opened again. She turned sharply, only to find Lady Agatha standing there, her eyes gleaming with something cruel. Eleanor's stomach dropped. "I must say," Lady Agatha drawled, stepping inside, "I didn't expect you to be here again so soon. But then again, perhaps I should have." Eleanor shot Charles a sharp look. "You told her?" But it wasn't Charles who answered. It was Agatha. "Oh, don't blame him," she said smoothly. "Men like Charles are predictable. When they find something rare, they either lock it away or put it on display." She gave Eleanor a slow, mocking glance. "I wonder which you'll be." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "I don't belong to anyone." Agatha's smirk widened. "That's where you're wrong." Charles stepped forward, his voice controlled but firm. "Enough, Agatha." She ignored him, her gaze still locked onto Eleanor. "Tell me, dear, do you truly think men like Charles offer opportunities out of kindness?" Eleanor stiffened. Agatha tilted her head. "No, they offer them because they expect something in return." Charles's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Agatha's laughter was light, amused. "Don't I?" She turned back to Eleanor. "You're not the first woman Charles has taken an interest in. And I doubt you'll be the last." Eleanor felt something inside her twist. She turned to Charles, searching his face for something. Some kind of denial, some kind of reassurance. But for the first time, he looked uncertain. That was all the answer she needed. Eleanor took a slow breath, then stepped away from them both. "I see." Charles's expression darkened. "It's not what you think." But Eleanor only shook her head. "No, it's exactly what I think." She turned on her heel and walked toward the doors. Neither Charles nor Agatha stopped her. She didn't need them to, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to walk away. And as she stepped out into the night, she realized her music had never belonged to anyone but herself. Eleanor stepped into the cold night, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. But with every step away from Whitmore Hall, she felt lighter, as if she had left behind a part of herself that was never truly hers to begin with. The streets were quiet, and the air smelled of rain, fresh and crisp, washing away the night's lingering tension. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to move, away from Charles, away from Lady Agatha, away from the tangled web she had almost been caught in. For so long, she had let others decide what she was worth. Tonight, she had taken that power back. By the time she reached Mrs. Winslow's house, her fingers were numb from the cold, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She pushed open the door to find the older woman sitting by the fireplace, waiting. Mrs. Winslow didn't speak right away. She simply studied Eleanor, as if searching for something in her expression. Finally, she sighed. "You walked away." Eleanor nodded. "I had to." Something flickered in Mrs. Winslow's eyes. Pride, relief, maybe both. "Then you made the right choice." Eleanor sank into the chair across from her, exhaustion finally settling into her bones. "He wasn't who I thought he was." Mrs. Winslow gave a small, knowing smile. "They never are." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence with warmth. Eleanor stared into the flames, feeling the pieces of the night slowly settle inside her. She had spent so much of her life believing that her music was something to be hidden, something that could only bring her harm. But tonight, she had learned something else. It wasn't the music that was dangerous. It was the people who wanted to own it. She had walked into Whitmore Hall as someone unsure of herself, uncertain of her place in the world. She had walked out knowing exactly who she was. Days passed, then weeks. The whispers about her performance at Whitmore Hall didn't fade as quickly as she hoped. People spoke of her in ways they never had before, some with admiration, others with suspicion. The invitations continued to come. Wealthy patrons who had heard of her talent, seeking to bring her into their world. But Eleanor didn't answer any of them. For the first time, she had no interest in playing for the approval of others. Instead, she found herself drawn back to the piano in Mrs. Winslow's small home, playing not for an audience, not for admiration, but simply because she wanted to. The music felt different now. Freer, unburdened by expectation. One evening, as she finished playing, Mrs. Winslow spoke from across the room. "What will you do now?" Eleanor ran her fingers over the keys, considering the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it is, it will be on my terms." Mrs. Winslow smiled. "That's the only way it should be." Eleanor met her gaze, feeling something settle deep inside her, certainty. She had spent her whole life being told who she was, where she belonged, what she could and could not be. Now, for the first time, she was choosing for herself. And that was more powerful than any song she could ever play.